Everything I'm talking about in this first part of this class is what nature does to make things healthy, to really support plant metabolism. And another piece is soil fertility. And soil fertility means soil amendments, mineral amendments, and a reading of soil tests. All these things that, for some people, seem to be like the guiding light. Soil chemistry. There's numbers involved. Numbers must have really strong meaning. And some of them do, and I'm going to give you one perspective on that. But whatever I say now is always trumped by the biology. We're just providing the foods for the biology. That's my approach to soil fertility. And this really begins with what I call orchard compost. So there is garden compost and there is orchard compost. Another way of saying this is there is bacterially dominated compost and there is fungally dominated compost. So when I make compost for my garden, and there are people here who can speak much more on the art of compost making, but when I make compost for my garden, I basically follow the half brown, half green rule. And that means brown materials, which are rich in carbon, be that straw, be that fallen leaves, be that topsoil with all kinds of microorganisms in the topsoil, and green materials, which are richer in nitrogen. So the kitchen waste, the alfalfa meal in the winter, the grass clippings, those types of things. Cow manure, fresh cow manure, that even though it's brown today, it was green yesterday. They're rich in nitrogen. And that means building layers that are 2 to 5, 6 inches of brown, layers 2 to 5, 6 inches of green. And there's more to it than that, but that combination is giving you a carbon to nitrogen ratio on the order of 25 to 1. And that is a pile that typically will heat up if you're doing it right. And a lot of people will make sure it heats up by turning the pile. And if it's organically certified compost, you're required to turn that pile 5 times in 30 days. That's generating lots of heat to destroy weed seeds and E. coli. I'm not a turner. I've come up with rationalizations for many of the easier ways to do things. But I take care of how I build that pile. And I do generate heat in that pile and things do break down. And heat is bacterial. And to turn a pile is to disturb it. So that's very great for building garden soils and for the broccoli and the beets and anything you're growing in the vegetable garden. When my piles are ready, 6 to 12 months later, and they're not completely broken down, but they're mostly broken down, half the pile goes to the garden use and half the pile gets combined with that same volume again of ramial wood chips. And that might be the aged softwood pile, it might be fresh hardwood chips, it depends what time of the year it is, what I have going on. And that pile is going to sit typically for 6 months, sometimes for 12 months. Depends when I make it, because I want to apply it in the fall. This is the piles that I'm going to spray with the fatty acids when I'm doing my general orchard sprays anyway. And it's through that non-disturbance that they're going to build and emphasize the fungal dynamic. So when I spread compost, yes, I'm interested in replenishing nutrients, but I'm also just as interested in microbe diversity going back out there in the orchard. And that combination with the wood chips leads to a carbon to nitrogen ratio more in the order of 40 to 1. And that's that fungal sweet spot that I'm after. And when you make orchard compost and you let it be, you'll actually see those white hyphal strands in the compost. And you can make out the wood chip element of it. So it's just feels fungal, as well as the fact that you're working towards that. Typically, I'll make these piles on the edge of the orchard. It might literally be on the forest edge. And if the maple trees and the beech trees extend their roots into that pile in the next 6 to 12 months, that means there's mycorrhizae in that compost now as well. You can't put mycorrhizae just in a compost pile in general. They only exist by having a relationship with roots. So something has to be growing into that pile for that to happen. The catalyst sprays, that's the fatty acids. Another thing I do, knowing that I'm going to apply this compost in the fall, is I can get a lot more bang for my buck when I want to spread something like, we'll get into the soil amendments, but something like azomite clay with all the trace minerals it has, or something like kelp meal, or if I'm looking to build up calcium levels, maybe it's gypsum. the one I purchased, not from the sheetrock. I'm going to explain how I need 4 cubic yards for an acre of orchard, and I'll break that down to a tree level. But 4 cubic yards is a pretty good sized pile. And to take a 40-pound bag of azomite and dump it over that pile and roughly fork it in usually around the beginning of August. I mean, it could be mid-July, it's not literal, but give it a couple months to be worked by the compost food web. That means when you spread that compost in the fall, the mineral nutrition that's in that soil amendment has already been taken up by biology, and it's in a bioavailable form. And that's why, I mean, you get more value for your use of that soil amendment. And this is what I call a soil condiment. It's just a little bit enhancing of the compost pile, but in a way that it's going to make those nutrients available quicker to the feeder roots. Another aspect of this is understanding that microbial diversity in compost lasts about 6 months beyond the point that compost gets mature. Now I'm talking about everything being totally broken down, the really nice looking stuff you might buy in a bag if you take your compost that far. And beyond that, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, you're spreading more of a woodsy mulch with a good organic matter and some mineral nutrition, but you're no longer spreading the biology. So you can't age a compost pile for a long, long, long time, as in a couple years, and have the same value. You have to understand when this diversity is at its peak. Another thing I do, kind of similar to the idea of compost condiments, is just understanding when feeder roots are having that flush. So if I want to add some nitrogen to get better growth on my young trees, or I want to add nitrogen on trees that are not having a good return bloom, or a very weak looking pear tree, that's something I'm going to do in spring, probably about the time of bloom, so that those amendments are in place when the spring feeder root flush comes in. So it helps guide my timing of when to apply. Similarly, we'll get to talking about lime and calcium in a minute. If I want to add something to boost calcium, or I want to add something like azomite clay, not through the compost, but directly to a tree, I'm going to do that usually in late July, early August. I'm not as busy with some of the other parts of the orchard then, but it's because I'm just preceding the fall feeder root flush. Again, it's all about when do I apply this? Well, it ties totally to the feeder roots. When are things going to be taken up? So that 4 cubic yards of compost that I'm talking about is a maintenance rate. So here I'm cueing into the fact that I'm decomposing the leaves that come off the tree in place. I'm bringing in some ramial wood chips. I'm taking the prunings and replenishing. I'm not pulling all that away. You're going to need more compost if your system of management is pulling a lot of that away. That maintenance rate of 2 tons, that equates to 4 cubic yards. And the way I break this down on a tree basis, for those of you with just a handful of trees, is I mostly work with what I call a semi-standard rootstock. So rootstocks have letters and numbers. So MM111 is a 70% vigorous root that was developed at the Malling Merton Research Station in England. That's the MM. And the 111 is not relevant, it's just the number it was given. Those are trees that are typically spaced about 16 by 24 feet in an orchard. And that amounts to about 110 trees per acre. And if I divide that 110, and I'm going to make it 100 because it's simpler, that 4 cubic yards, if you do the math, works down to each tree spaced that distance needing 1.5 5-gallon buckets of compost. So it isn't that much. And so that's a tree with a 16-foot diameter or an 8-foot radius. So that just helps you maybe get an idea of what's the maintenance rate of compost. Now, if you have more, that's great. It's not wrong to apply more, but this is a minimum, and its application is going to tie into the disease cycles. So Charles Walters started Acres USA magazine, and basically what we know is the eco-agricultural movement, and he talked about plants being touched with balanced nutrition. So at the very beginning of this talk, we talked about plant metabolism. We talked about mycorrhizae having this underground economy. That whole business of balance comes from the biology. And when those nutrients are available to the plant and there's nothing missing and protein synthesis is complete, this is that idea that high Brix plants are not going to be attractive to pests or disease. And it makes sense because we now understand that pests can't consume complete proteins. And we also understand now that plants that have a diverse fungal biology, fungal-dominated biology, have reserve energy to produce some of the phenolics that helps resist disease. So it's still about the biology, even though it seems like we're talking about fertility. This is that Bob Wiltz, the blueberry grower in Oregon. This whole notion that we need to stock the pantry properly. And now we're going to get into how I kind of look at soil testing. There's kind of two different schools of thought. One school of thought is that of mineral sufficiency, that every element is there in a sufficient amount to optimize yields. So that's kind of the conventional way of looking at this. The other school of thought is not just looking at sustainable yields. That may not be as much of a yield. We can get into that if we want to. But looking also at what makes for plants that can stand up to disease. What can we learn from soil testing that maybe helps us make a more resistant plant to disease? And that's the aspect that really interests me. So, the basic things that you start with are getting that pH into the 6.3 to 6.7 range. And that's all because when you look at all the different elements, in terms of acidity and alkalinity in the soil, most of them are most available in that range of the pH scale. Another thing is organic matter, getting it to 3% or more. That's the fungal food part. Without that, the biology doesn't function. So it's an important thing to be thinking about. I mean, when you get into growing organically and using compost and mulch, that's going to happen. But if you haven't tuned into that yet, you have to think about it. Another part of this story, when we talk about pH, we open the door to talking about lime. And when we're talking about lime, we're basically talking about calcium and magnesium component of the soil. And there needs to be a certain balance there in terms of that eco-ag principle of resisting disease. And that balance is something that's reflected by what's called the cation exchange capacity of your soil. That's the ability of your soil to hold nutrients. So in order to talk about ratios between these different positively charged cations, we have to start with a baseline. And that baseline is ideally going to be 3,000 pounds of calcium per acre. Now, soil testing is complicated because there's different ways of extracting nutrients, and some are a lot less aggressive. That has to be taken into account as well. But this notion that we want to get calcium to a certain point before we start talking about ratios is part of this story. Another thing to understand is that magnesium helps bind more porous soils together. So in a more sandy soil, a soil with a much lower CEC number, we're going to have a little bit more magnesium. I'll call it tolerance, because sometimes magnesium can be way out of balance. On the other hand, calcium helps spread soil particles apart. So with a clay soil, we're going to have even some more calcium into the picture. So in terms of those ratios, the first thing I'm looking at is I want to get calcium on the order of 7 times that of the magnesium proportion. So one of the things that you'll see on some soil tests, not every lab does this, is what's known as the base saturation ratios, and that's given as a percentage. So here I'm looking for those numbers. 70, that's the calcium number, the middle number is magnesium, and the end number is potassium. I'm looking for that ideal loam to have something on the order of 70 to 10 to 3 plus. And this is not rigid. This is all in flux. You can take a soil test at different points in the season and see different numbers. And so you just have to relax with this. Keep in mind the biology is a big part of the picture. If it's a more sandy soil, that means you have a low cation exchange capacity, a number on the order of 2 to 4 to 6. You're going to want more magnesium in that soil. And magnesium might go up to 16 to 18. And proportionally, it's not quite the 7 to 1, but you need that structural advantage as well. And if it's a more heavy clay soil, and now I'm talking about a CEC number that gets to be on the order of 16, 18, 22, 24, there you want some more extra calcium. So the numbers fluctuate a little bit based on the type of soil that you have. Now let's talk about the art of liming. And this is all based on this idea of cation balance. Lime moves slowly down into the soil. So when we're preparing orchard ground, and ideally taking maybe a year to cover crop, and there's different cover crop scenarios for different situations, that's an opportunity because you're disturbing the soil, whether it's tilling or plowing, to get lime down deeper. And usually when you come onto ground that no one has been working in this respect, there's a pretty strong need for lime to get that pH into that range that you want. And sometimes the recommendations will be for more than even 2 tons per acre. I kind of cut it off at 2 tons per acre because that's a lot for microbes to take. You know, that's kind of a big whump of calcium carbonate in terms of microbe viability. So the incorporation phase is one point where you can add a lot more. The maintenance phase is once the trees have been planted. And now we're talking about the fact that acid rain happens, calcium is taken out of the orchard and the fruit, maybe the ramio wood chips, it just falls behind. And in touching base through soil testing every few years, you notice I need to add a little more calcium. Now I don't want to add lime by the ton. I want to add it on the rate of maybe 400 pounds, maybe as much as 600 pounds per acre, because I'm not incorporating it, and I have a biology now that I'm trying to get up and running. I don't want to whump it. That lime is something I want to serve with molasses and humates. So that might take the form of spreading a pelleted lime. Pelleted is basically a sugar carbon coating. So that's where the molasses offers a food for the biology to help uptake the lime. Humates, you might do a humic acid spray. If you're spreading this maintenance lime by way of the compost, you could add humates to the compost pile. It just helps the biology incorporate this calcium. And this is something that I will apply in the fall when the leaves have started to fall. And I'll get into explaining that, but it helps hinder the development of scab diseases if it's timed right. So I just want to take advantage of that, knowing how that works. Another thing that's very pertinent is the relationship between potassium and phosphorus, and phosphorus being P, potassium K. In eco-agricultural thinking, higher Brix numbers are found when P is twice that of K, a 2-to-1 ratio. When we're adding lots of ramio wood chips and decomposing all this organic matter, we're restoring potassium a lot. So I shoot for 1-to-1 in the orchard. And often, you'll find that phosphorus is short. And particularly in the early years, before the biology is up and running, the mycorrhizae are able to go gather the nutrients for the tree. There's a need for more rock phosphate just to provide that to start to push things in that direction. So when I work with an orchardist in terms of consultant work, there's the lime phase, and then a year or two later, looking at more of some of these types of things. But this is all about nutrient density. This is what people have observed in the ground, where the Brix numbers read pretty high in vegetable and fruit production. There was a man, a soil scientist from France, named Francis Charbouchot, who back in the 70s and 80s started looking at disease-free tomato with lots of disease pressure, apples with lots of scab, apples that didn't get scab, and looking at what's the relationship of soil fertility in the ground. And his whole thing was, he called it trophobiosis, but it was really about optimized protein synthesis, the things we were talking about in the very beginning. And one of the things he found was that when calcium to potassium was on the order of 20-to-1, so several slides ago I showed you the numbers 70, 10, 3 plus. 3 plus times 20 is 70. When it's on the order of 20-to-1, the plant produces a lot less of an amino acid called asparagine. And so when protein synthesis breaks down, the result is an amino acid. Scabs, the scab fungus's favorite food, is asparagine. So by getting this part of the soil dynamic correct, you get a big leg up on not providing the food that scab likes. So we're going to get into scab and talking about spraying sulfur and the holistic alternatives, but this is really fundamental to getting things right to begin with. So this notion of fertility ratios is where I go. Then we get to the micronutrients, and we won't hang out here for long, but let's just pick one, molybdenum. This is required by the nitrate reductase enzyme. So if you're having a problem with rots, brown rot being among them, or bitter rot on the apple, one of the things to look at is molybdenum. Now when I get to talking about trace minerals, I'm mostly going to take a country cook's perspective, in that I don't so much say I need this particular chelated mineral form as much as I want to provide it in a general sense. And that general sense for me comes about by regularly using things like kelp meal. So I feed kelp meal to our sheep, and then their manure, their poop, goes into the compost, comes out, eventually breaks down. Well, that kelp meal has a wide range of trace minerals. That's one way I'm boosting it. I spread kelp meal on my compost pile as I build them. It's not so much a 4-inch layer, but it's just a sprinkling. But it's trace minerals being added to that pile. Similarly with azomite clay. I use that in the planting hole. I sprinkle compost as I build compost piles. This is something I add to my orchard compost just because there's lots of nutrition. If I have a weak tree, a pear that just has more yellow leaves, just doesn't seem to have the vigor, I'll actually do a dose of 10 to 15 pounds just in its radius, just because I know trace minerals play such a big role. So you could take the flip side and get into analyzing your soil every few months and spraying specific foliars, but I just like to go about it in a more general way. And we'll talk about sea minerals a little bit more in just a minute. Another concept is the notion that minerals eventually get depleted, and the glaciers have restored these minerals every 10,000 years. Now, we don't have to all pray that an ice age comes through really quick, but the notion of taking rock dust, and whether this is in the garden bed, out in the orchard, in the maple sugar bush, rock dust can be quite available from a local rock quarry. I mean, you can also buy them, but sometimes this can be part of your resource system, and just to be aware that maybe you can get that basalt or that granite meal from a place that is cost effective.